Chapter 14 is on the autonomic nervous system. It's a very interesting part of the entire nervous system. So you've seen this diagram before, and we're going to look at only the autonomic nervous system section. So the autonomic nervous system essentially is going to be the highlighted boxes that you see in the lower right-hand corner of your slide. It's motor neurons that innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as glands. And it all works automatically to make adjustments to ensure optimal support for all body activity. So this would include things like adjusting the heart rate, the blood pressure, digestive activities, and it works with subconscious control, which of course means it's involuntary, or also called general visceral motor system. So let's take a look at the difference between the autonomic nervous system versus the somatic nervous system. And recall, the somatic nervous system goes to the body and it is voluntary. So one of the big differences here is that the autonomic nervous system is automatic or involuntary. So it deals only with motor fibers, effectors, which innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, whereas the somatic nervous system is skeletal muscle. And that's essentially what you learned about in chapter 9 with skeletal muscles. There's also different efferent pathways and ganglia. Remember that a ganglia is a group of cell bodies. So in the somatic nervous system, there is a single thick myelinated axon that goes directly to the smooth muscle. In the case of the autonomic nervous system, there's a two-chain neuron pathway. There's one that's before the ganglia and one after the ganglia. The one before the ganglia we call preganglionic neuron, and the one after is called the postganglionic or ganglionic. So the preganglionic is a lightly myelinated axon going to the ganglia. Think of the ganglia as the meeting place between the preganglia neuron and the postganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron is going to go from the ganglia to the effector organ. And the effector organ would be things like the heart, the blood vessels, the GI tract, essentially any of the organs that are going to be affected by the autonomic nervous system. Then the target organ responds to neurotransmitters. The one you learned about in chapter 9 was acetylcholine. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic one is always going to release acetylcholine, and the postganglionic is going to release either norepinephrine or acetylcholine. So there's not too many different neurotransmitters that you need to learn. There's an overlap of the somatic and autonomic function in that the higher brain centers can regulate and coordinate both systems. And most spinal and cranial nerves are going to control both as well. And you're going to learn later on about something called biofeedback, where our higher brain cortex has an ability to affect the autonomic nervous system. So an example of this could be that active muscles require more oxygen and glucose. So the autonomic nervous system nerve speeds up the heart rate and opens the airways. So there's certainly a somatic role that happens here, but there's also an autonomic nervous system role that affects here. So this is a diagram that shows the comparison between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. So with the somatic nervous system, it's only one single neuron that goes from the central nervous system to the effectors. It releases acetylcholine, which excites skeletal muscle. So again, that's what you learned about in chapter 9. The autonomic nervous system has two different divisions. It's got one, which is the fight or flight division, the sympathetic division, and it's one that is the rest and digest division. The difference between those two is the essentially the neurotransmitter and the difference between the pre and the postganglionic. So the preganglionic for sympathetic is shorter than the parasympathetic. It's longer. Notice that both preganglionic for the sympathetic and the parasympathetic release acetylcholine. So that's always the same. So if you're asked what the preganglionic neurotransmitter is, it doesn't matter whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, it's always acetylcholine. What differs is the postganglionic axon. And remember, the ganglia is a group of cell bodies. Just like in the brain, you learned that a group of cell bodies was the basal nucleus. In this case now, the sympathetic postganglionic neuron is going to release norepinephrine. Think of that kind of like adrenaline. The parasympathetic division is going to release acetylcholine, and that slows things down. So the effect can either be excitatory or inhibitory based on what effectors or receptors that neurotransmitter actually binds to. So our next slide is going to be a focus figure from your textbook, which does a really nice job of showing the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic. In this case, the parasympathetic division is going to promote maintenance functions, and it conserves body energy. The sympathetic we're going to see on the next slide. So this person, they're in normal activity. We have a person that is bringing a pizza here. We have somebody that's bringing a blanket and then a bag. So they're going to have a picnic. So during rest, the parasympathetic division is going to be activated. It's rest and digest, keeps the body energy low as possible. And it's the 3Ds, digestion, defecation, and diuresis, which is urination. For the cardiovascular system, the heart rate and blood pressure are low. And for the vision, the pupils constrict, the lungs adjust for closed vision. So she's looking at her cell phone here, relaxing activity. So any of those D activities would be the parasympathetic division. You can also see down here that there's increased gastrointestinal tract activity. Our next slide is showing the sympathetic nervous system. So all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's a gator that comes up onto shore, which we see here. And that makes sense because we live in Florida. So it's a great example. The sympathetic division is going to be responsible for exciting or threatening situations. So during excitement, it's called the fight or flight system, energizes stores, and the 3 E's, exercise, excitement, and emergency. As you can imagine, if you're running away from an alligator, the heart rate and blood pressure are going to be increased. The visceral blood vessels constrict to pump blood to the skeletal muscles so this person can run as fast as they can. The pupils are going to dilate for far vision, so it allows them to see the whole threatening scene and decide where to run to. The digestive system is basically shut off because we're not worried about digesting a pizza at this point. We're worried about getting away from this alligator as fast as possible. So the liver releases as much glucose into the body as possible. And then finally, the respiratory system, we need air, oxygen as fast as possible. So the bronchioles are going to dilate. Also, for the digestive system, the last thing you're thinking about is having a bowel movement. You're definitely not going to stop to urinate or defecate because you're trying to get away from that alligator. You could fight the alligator because it's fight or flight, but I definitely wouldn't recommend that unless you're really, really well trained.